Hello students, today's video lecture is on the internal anatomy of the brain. Now we have already completed the external anatomy of the brain and I've showed you all these various pictures. So these notes are already completed. Remember we have the largest part of the brain, which is the cerebrum, made of all these different lobes, and then the cerebellum, which is the smaller quote-unquote little brain under the occipital lobe. And now we're moving to the internal brain, including the part of the brain called the diencephalon. So this is not something you can see from the surface. And then the brain stem, which will turn into the spinal cord. So we're going to start out by labeling what we already know. And all of those parts are the ones without any markings on them, all the lines without any markings. So let's start there. The first one I want to label is this section of the cerebrum right here, and that is the frontal lobe. Let's move to this section back here, not all the way in the back, but sort of upper back area, and that's the parietal lobe. Right underneath the parietal lobe is the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe will have been removed in order for us to see this mid-sagittal section of the brain. So we have this mini brain that sits underneath the occipital lobe called the cerebellum. And then we also have the connector between the two halves or hemispheres of the cerebrum called the corpus callosum. So now that we have all of the empty ones taken care of, let's move on to our new information. Okay, so there's a part of the brain called the diencephalon. This is a major region, kind of like we learned about the cerebrum, and it has several important parts included. So the first one is called the thalamus, and that's going to be part A on our diagram. So if we go up to the diagram and we find part A, we'll go ahead and label it, change colors so you know it's new, thalamus. And I will also show you where to color. It will be very helpful for you on your reviews if you go ahead and color as I am showing you. Okay, I have the thalamus marked, colored, and labeled. And let's talk about what the job of the thalamus is. Notice the thalamus is kind of the connection between the spinal cord and brainstem, and then there's this, sort of sitting between the brainstem area and the rest of the cerebrum. So I think the best analogy for what the thalamus does is that it acts like a router. And it sends information to various parts of the brain, wherever that happens to be appropriate. So for example, if you have touch information coming up through the spinal cord, the thalamus is going to know to send that over to the parietal lobe. If you have some kind of message you're sending to a skeletal muscle from the frontal lobe, the thalamus is going to be part of what directs that down to the skeletal muscles. So I'll put in here, it acts like a sorting center for the brain, functionally connects the spinal cord and brainstem to the other parts of the brain, and directs impulse traffic. So it sort of sorts or routes where the impulses should be going. Now, right underneath the thalamus is this very small piece right here called the hypothalamus. So that's going to be part B, hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is a very visually unimpressive part. However, this is a super important part of the brain. So I'm going to go ahead and color our hypothalamus and show you exactly where to color in the diagram as well. So the prefix hypo means below. And we can see here that we are indeed below the thalamus. So that's why this part is called the hypothalamus. Now, what's really important about the hypothalamus is that it directs a lot of parts of our homeostasis. Our entire autonomic nervous system, which is all of our involuntary stuff. I'm not talking about like your muscles twitching. I'm talking about body temperature and, those kinds of crazy important homeostasis regulations. So that's the hypothalamus there below the thalamus. Again, hypo is a prefix that means below, so it literally means below thalamus. And then there's a part of the diencephalon that we actually can't view because it's out of the plane that this is divided on. And that is known as the limbic system. Now, the limbic system are parts that would be either deeper from where we are right now or closer out of the page. And so that's why they're not visible here. But the limbic system is divided into two parts. So it may help you if we draw an arrow down to here, where we list our two main parts of the limbic system. And if you ever do any more learning about the brain, you'll definitely hear these two parts. The first one is called the amygdala. Pretend that the Y is an I, amygdala. Amygdala is where the majority of our emotions and our emotional memories come from. So there's a popular expression that talks about someone being quote unquote triggered. And if you really think about that, triggers are a lot of times past trauma. You have emotional memories from past trauma, and something happens in the present that brings back those memories and your reactions to those memories. That is all happening in the amygdala. It is one of the most basic and oldest parts of the brain. So think triggered for the amygdala, and then also you can think of the expression Amy is emotional. Sorry if your name is Amy, I'm just using it as a memory device because we do have the name Amy right at the beginning of the word. So think Amy is emotional. The amygdala, which starts with the word Amy, is where our emotions are processed, regulated and processed. The other part of the limbic system is called the hippocampus. And again, these aren't parts that are visible in our diagram up here because they're out of the plane that this picture is dissected in. But the hippocampus is also associated with memories, but these are learning memories, like what you are generating right now as you listen. So here's a little helpful expression to lock in that the hippocampus is related to learning. You go to the campus to learn. So if you're going to do some higher learning, you're going to go onto a college campus, or technically right now you're probably on a high school campus. So you go to the campus to learn. So hippocampus is the area where we're able to learn new things. And it's one of the only areas of the brain that we can actually make new neurons. Everywhere else you have what you have and that's it. But here we can actually produce new neurons in the hippocampus. So right now, your hippocampus is learning about itself. Okay, I want to show you these two parts since we can't see them in our diagram and you're looking at this and thinking, well, this is some kind of a strange headset we have here. So let me put the skin in for reference. Notice no eyes because they're a sensory system associated with the nervous system. So I'm actually going to go ahead and delete some of this. I'm going to delete the hair, funky hairdo, and I'm going to hide the skin of the head, which is creepy, but now you can kind of tell where we're at. I'm going to go ahead and delete this as well. So facing forward are the parts that I discussed, and this is all the parts of the limbic system, but most notably is the amygdala. Did you see where I clicked? It looks like a tiny little bean here and here. Those are the amygdala. The hippocampus is much larger here and here. Again, you're not going to see these on your diagram because the diagram dissection line is right in the middle. And so you're not going to, see either of these structures in your diagram, but I just wanted to give you a quick look at where they were. So that takes care of the diencephalon. It's the central part of the brain. We'll also take a look at a little bitty gland in just a little bit that's behind the thalamus. And a lot of times that's included in the diencephalon, so that'll be the three parts. Let's go ahead and move on to part number 4, the brainstem. So the brainstem is going to be these three parts right here, C, D, and E. And I'm going to go ahead and list them in order from superior or upper to inferior or lower. Now, the most superior part of the brainstem is called the midbrain. So I'm going to label that up on the top, letter C. Then we will move into the area called the pons. You'll see it's bigger. It looks like a little round belly. And then letter E is the medulla oblongata. So all three of those parts in order from upper to lower make up the brainstem. So let's add these to our diagram at the top. So again, midbrain, E is the pons, and E, the medulla oblongata. Funny name. Okay, for coloring, I'll show you where to color. The midbrain is at the top, and it's just this section right here. You can see the pons is this round part right here, much thicker than the midbrain or than the medulla. So it's always this round belly right here. And the medulla oblongata is this last piece. I'm going to end it right here because that's about where the cerebellum stops. Notice I stopped right about there. And I know the occipital bone of the skull comes down here. Then there's an opening for the spinal cord to come out. So as soon as this structure exits the hole in the occipital bone of the skull, it is now the spinal cord. So I'm just going to label that as well. Remember, the spinal cord is a separate organ from the brain. It's not a part of the brain. So we have our midbrain, our pons, and our medulla oblongata in order from superior to inferior. Now, in terms of functions, notice this bracket here. We're not going to divide the functions into each individual piece. We're just going to talk about it as a whole unit, which is called the brainstem. So the brainstem is one of the deepest parts of the brain, along with the diencephalon, and it does some of the most basic life functions. So I'm going to put that as sort of a heading and then elaborate on that. Breathing, need that. Regulating blood pressure, that's definitely important. Regulating your heart rate, which goes along with blood pressure, and also controls your consciousness, like whether you are awake or if someone gets a brainstem injury, they could end up in a coma. Okay, or have a partial vegetative state happening if they have a brainstem injury. So basic life functions like cannot live without a functioning brainstem. The same is true of the diencephalon. You cannot live without the activities of the diencephalon. The sorter, the homeostasis, this is really like the emotional nervous system. But that gives you, I would say, probably a quality of life. I'm going to add emotional nervous system to that. So those are the four parts. There's a little bit left. The brainstem, the diencephalon, and then, of course, last class we talked about the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Lastly, there are two glands that are directly associated with the brain, and I want to mention those, tell you what they do, and then we'll put them in the diagram as well. So the pineal gland is a gland that secretes the hormone called melatonin. And melatonin helps you sleep. Now, the way that we go about secreting melatonin is sort of an indirect effect. Your brain or your eyes experience light that stimulates part of the brain, and the message travels through this long pathway to get to the pineal gland. So because its melatonin production is affected by light, sometimes this gland is referred to as your third eye. And you will notice, obviously, you start to feel sleepy at night because there's a lot less light. Although inside lighting and especially electronic devices really interfere with our melatonin production. It's specifically the blue light that interferes with melatonin production. So if you have trouble sleeping at night and you've been on your cell phone for hours and hours, you may want to get yourself a pair of blue light blocking glasses, or turn on the blue light shield on your cell phone so that you can make that melatonin appropriately so you can sleep. So the pineal gland is a tiny little gland back here, pineal gland, and I'll color it so you know where to look. I'm going to go with something kind of bold. Just a little tiny gland right back here, okay, behind the thalamus. The last gland of the brain, and it's technically not part of the brain, but it's directly associated with it, is another P, pituitary. And the pituitary gland is in direct contact with the hypothalamus, and it works incredibly closely with the hypothalamus, and it ends up sort of being the director of the majority of your endocrine system. Now, keep in mind the endocrine system is our system of hormones. So the pituitary gland they call sort of the master gland. So this is in part how the hypothalamus is able to control so much, because it has a direct relationship with the pituitary gland. So I put in your notes, the pituitary gland is the choreographer of the majority of your endocrine system, our system of hormones. It works in close relationship with the hypothalamus of the brain. So let's go ahead and color our pituitary gland, and I'll show you where that is as well. The pituitary gland is right underneath the hypothalamus. So here's the hypothalamus, and it hangs down kind of like the uvula on the back of your throat. Okay, and I'll go ahead and label that too, and then we'll take a look at the atlas. Okay, looking in the atlas, I have a brain here, obviously, and this is all cerebrum, cerebellum. We see a little bit of the brainstem. We see this fatter part is the pons, and then the medulla would be, really, it should cut off about here. So medulla oblongata, cerebellum, cerebrum, divided into the lobes. This is the pons. That's what we can see from here. And then if I turn, half the brain is missing or partial. So imagine the rest of the brain. This blue part right here is actually this sort of internal fluid-filled space inside the brain, and this half has it as well. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the fluid-filled spaces so we can get a better look. A lot of fluid-filled spaces in there. And what we're seeing is one half from the top, and this is the front, and this is the back, one half of the thalamus. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that as well so we can see what it looks like in cross-section. Okay, I've deleted that, and let's take a look. So this part right here is the corpus callosum, mainly this area up here. This is actually a separate like little space. And here's the thalamus. Right here, this is the thalamus. The two halves of the thalamus, you can see this is the left half, and then there would be a right half, would be connected by this little, almost like little weld right here in the middle. So that's the thalamus. The hypothalamus, although it doesn't look like it's connected, it technically is. That's the hypothalamus there. And then here's the pituitary gland here and here. It's divided into two parts. Here's the pituitary gland, and here's that connection. Oops, here's that connection to the hypothalamus. I don't know that we're going to be able to see the pineal gland, but it'd be back here behind the thalamus. And then, of course, we're looking at the brainstem. Here is the midbrain, pons, and this would be the medulla oblongata, and then turning into the spinal cord. So there you have it, the internal parts of the brain.